On the morning of October 13th, 1841, 23 guests witnessed what Hartford's upper society would later call the most shocking wedding ceremony in Connecticut's history. Within minutes of taking her first sip of ceremonial wine, 19-year-old Bridget O'Sullivan collapsed at the altar of Trinity Episcopal Church, her wedding dress pooling around her convulsing body as white foam escaped her lips. The bride's final words, heard clearly by the front pew, were a desperate whisper. "The wine, it burns." What authorities discovered 3 days later would expose a calculated murder so cold-blooded that the Hartford Courant refused to print the full details, fearing public outrage. The killer sat among the wedding guests, watching every agonizing moment with the composure of someone who had planned each detail for months. Before we continue with the story of Eleanor Pemberton and the O'Sullivan family tragedy, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments which state or city you're listening from. Your engagement helps us bring these forgotten American mysteries to light. The truth behind what happened that autumn morning reveals a web of social hatred, financial desperation, and maternal obsession that would reshape Hartford's elite society forever. Hartford in 1841 stood at the crossroads of old New England tradition and industrial progress. The Connecticut River carried steamboats loaded with goods from New York, while new factories sprouted along its banks, their smokestacks competing with church spires for dominance of the skyline. The city's population had swelled to nearly 13,000 souls, with Irish immigrants flooding in to work the mills and railroads that promised prosperity to anyone willing to labor from dawn to dusk. Among Hartford's established families, none commanded more respect than the Pembertons. Eleanor Pemberton, 48 years old and widowed for 6 years, ruled over one of the city's most prominent households from her federal-style mansion on Prospect Street. The 3-story brick home, with its perfectly manicured gardens and wrought iron fencing, served as a symbol of everything the old Connecticut elite represented: stability, tradition, and unquestionable social superiority. Eleanor had not been born into wealth. The daughter of a modestly successful Hartford merchant, she had married above her station when she wed Jonathan Pemberton in 1815. Jonathan, heir to a shipping fortune built during the War of 1812, had chosen Eleanor for her beauty and sharp intelligence rather than her pedigree. Their marriage had been a love match that scandalized some members of Hartford society, but Jonathan's success in expanding the family business into insurance and manufacturing had silenced most critics. Their only child, William, had been born in 1817 after 3 miscarriages that left Eleanor convinced he was a miracle. She devoted herself entirely to his upbringing, ensuring he received the finest education available. William attended Yale College, where he studied law and literature, returning to Hartford in 1839 to join his father's business interests. Tall and scholarly, with his father's dark hair and his mother's penetrating grey eyes, William Pemberton was considered one of Hartford's most eligible bachelors. When Jonathan died suddenly of apoplexy in 1835, Eleanor found herself in control of an estate worth approximately $40,000, a fortune that made her one of the wealthiest women in Connecticut. She managed the family's investments with an iron hand, determined to preserve not only their wealth, but their social position. The Pemberton name opened doors throughout New England, and Eleanor intended to keep it that way. The Irish migration to Hartford had accelerated throughout the 1830s, driven by poverty and crop failures in Ireland. These newcomers settled in the area near the railroad depot in cramped tenements that lacked proper sanitation. They worked for wages that established residents considered insulting. Yet their willingness to labor for so little drove down costs for factory owners and created resentment among American-born workers. Eleanor observed these changes with growing alarm. At Ladies' Aid Society meetings, she listened to complaints about Irish servants who allegedly stole from their employers, about Irish children who fought with proper American youngsters, about Irish families who crowded 10 people into spaces meant for 4. The established families of Hartford began to speak of the Irish problem in hushed tones, wondering aloud whether these Catholic foreigners could ever truly become Americans. Into this atmosphere of social tension came the O'Sullivan family in late 1839. Patrick O'Sullivan, a widower of 38, had brought his 4 children to Hartford after hearing of work opportunities in the city's expanding mills. His eldest daughter, Bridget, was 17 when they arrived, a striking young woman with auburn hair and emerald eyes that seemed to capture light, even in Hartford's grey winter months. Patrick found work as a supervisor at Colt's Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company, where his experience with machinery in Dublin's textile mills proved valuable. The salary allowed him to rent a small but respectable house on Front Street, closer to Hartford Centre than most Irish families could afford. Bridget took a position as a seamstress in one of the better dress shops on State Street, where her skill with delicate fabrics and her ability to speak without a heavy brogue made her popular with customers. It was at Wadsworth Athenaeum's public lecture series that Bridget first encountered William Pemberton. The lecture, delivered by a visiting professor from Harvard on the topic of American literature, had drawn Hartford's intellectual elite. Bridget attended because her employer, Mrs. Catherine Hendricks, had encouraged her Irish employees to better themselves through education and culture. William noticed her immediately. Seated in the back section reserved for working people, Bridget listened with an intensity that impressed him. When the lecturer opened the floor for questions, she raised her hand to ask about the influence of Irish poetry on American writers, a question so thoughtful and well articulated that several people turned to look at her with surprise. After the lecture, William approached her as she gathered her cloak. "That was an excellent question about Irish literary influence," he said, removing his hat. "I'm William Pemberton. I don't believe we've been introduced." Bridget's cheeks colored slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Bridget O'Sullivan, Mr. Pemberton. I'm pleased to make your acquaintance." They walked together toward State Street, talking about books and ideas with an ease that surprised them both. William learned that despite her limited formal education, Bridget had read voraciously, everything from Shakespeare to contemporary American authors. She had borrowed books from a kind priest in Dublin and continued reading whatever she could obtain in Hartford's lending libraries. When they reached the corner where their paths diverged, William hesitated. "Miss O'Sullivan, I wonder, would you care to attend next week's lecture? It's to be about American history, and I suspect you might find it interesting." Bridget's smile transformed her entire face. "I would enjoy that very much, Mr. Pemberton." Their courtship began quietly, carefully. William understood the social implications of his interest in an Irish working girl, but Bridget's intelligence and grace convinced him that such considerations were petty and unworthy. They met for walks along the Connecticut River, attended lectures and cultural events, and discovered a compatibility that transcended their different backgrounds. Eleanor remained unaware of these developments for nearly 6 months. William had always been discreet about his personal affairs, and she assumed his frequent absences from home reflected his dedication to business matters or social obligations with young men of his own class. The revelation came on a humid afternoon in July 1840. Eleanor had decided to surprise William with a visit to his office at the Pemberton Building on State Street, bringing him cold lemonade and news of an invitation to the governor's summer reception. As she climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, she heard voices from behind his office door, William's familiar baritone and a woman's voice she didn't recognize. "My mother will never accept this," William was saying, "but I don't care about her approval anymore, Bridget. I love you, and that's what matters." Eleanor froze on the landing, her hand gripping the lemonade pitcher so tightly her knuckles went white. "Your family's position in society," the woman replied, her voice carrying a slight Irish accent that made Eleanor's blood run cold. "I don't want to be the cause of trouble between you and your mother, William. She sacrificed so much for you." "You don't understand," William said firmly. "She's controlled every aspect of my life since Father died, whom I should marry, where I should live, how I should spend my time. I'm 23 years old, and I've never made a single important decision without her approval. That ends now." Eleanor pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding so hard she feared they might hear it through the door. "When will you tell her about us?" the woman asked. Soon, very soon. I want you to meet her properly as my intended bride. She'll see what I see in you, your intelligence, your kindness, your strength. She'll have to accept that I've chosen the woman I want to spend my life with. The sound of a chair scraping across the floor sent Eleanor fleeing down the stairs, abandoning the lemonade on the landing. She reached her carriage in a state of near panic, ordering her driver to take her home immediately. During the brief ride to Prospect Street, her shock gave way to a rage so pure and consuming that she felt physically ill. An Irish girl, her William, heir to the Pemberton fortune and name, was planning to marry an Irish immigrant. Everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed and schemed to preserve, would be destroyed by this. This nobody who had probably seduced her innocent son with calculated charm. That evening, William came home for dinner, appearing more cheerful than he had in months. Eleanor watched him carefully, noting the way he hummed under his breath while carving the roast, the satisfied smile that played at the corners of his mouth. She wanted to confront him immediately, to demand an explanation. But her years of social maneuvering had taught her patience. She needed information before she could act effectively. "You seem in excellent spirits tonight, William," she said, keeping her voice light. "Do I? Well, I suppose I am. I've been thinking about making some changes in my life, important changes." "Oh? What sort of changes?" William set down his fork and looked directly at her. "Mother, I've met someone, a young woman of exceptional character and intelligence. I believe she might be the person I want to marry." Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. "How wonderful, dear. Anyone I know?" "No, but I'm eager for you to meet her. Her name is Bridget O'Sullivan, and she's—" He paused as if gathering courage. "She's from Ireland originally. Her family came to Hartford 2 years ago." The water glass slipped from Eleanor's fingers, shattering against her plate. "Oh, how clumsy of me," she said, rising to ring for the servants. "You said O'Sullivan? An Irish family?" "Yes. Her father works at Colt's factory, and she's employed at Mrs. Hendricks's dress shop." "Mother, I know what you're thinking, but—" "I'm not thinking anything, William," Eleanor interrupted, her voice carefully controlled. "I'm simply surprised. You've never mentioned this young woman before." "I wanted to be certain of my feelings before discussing her with you, but I am certain now. I love her, Mother, and I intend to ask for her hand in marriage." Eleanor spent the remainder of the evening in her private sitting room, pacing the Persian carpet until she wore a visible path in the pattern. William's words echoed in her mind. He loved this Irish girl, intended to marry her. The implications struck her like physical blows. Marriage to an Irish immigrant would destroy William's social standing. The best families in Hartford would close their doors to him. His children would carry the stigma of their mixed heritage, neither fully accepted by the established elite nor welcomed by the Irish community that would see them as traitors to their origins. More immediately threatening was the financial risk. If William married this girl, Eleanor would lose all influence over family affairs. As his wife, the Irish woman would have legal rights to the Pemberton fortune. She might convince William to support her extended family, to make donations to Catholic causes, to invest in schemes that benefited immigrants at the expense of established American interests. Eleanor had not clawed her way from merchant-class origins to the pinnacle of Hartford society only to watch an Irish peasant destroy everything she had built. She would not allow her family's wealth to be squandered on Catholic churches and Irish relatives. She would not see the Pemberton name dragged through the mud by association with foreign poverty and superstition. Over the following weeks, Eleanor conducted a careful investigation of the O'Sullivan family. She learned that Patrick O'Sullivan was considered a reliable worker, but had been involved in labor discussions that some viewed as potentially subversive. Bridget was well regarded by her employer and customers, but several society matrons whispered about the impropriety of an Irish girl putting on airs above her station. Eleanor also discovered that the O'Sullivans attended Mass at Holy Trinity Church, the Catholic institution that many Protestant Hartford residents viewed with suspicion and distrust. The thought of her grandchildren being raised as Catholics, owing allegiance to a foreign pope, filled her with horror. As summer turned to autumn, William's relationship with Bridget deepened. He brought her to a few public events, introducing her to his friends with obvious pride and affection. Eleanor watched from a distance as Hartford society reacted with polite surprise that quickly gave way to whispered speculation. The breaking point came in early September when William announced his intention to formally propose. "I've spoken with Mr. O'Sullivan," he told his mother over breakfast. "He's given his permission for me to ask for Bridget's hand. I plan to propose this evening." Eleanor set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "William, I must ask you to reconsider this decision." "Mother, please, let me finish. I've said nothing about this association because I hoped it would run its natural course. But you're talking about marriage now, about permanent commitments that will affect not just your life but the future of our family." William's jaw tightened. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying that marriage is about more than personal feelings. It's about social compatibility, shared values, common backgrounds. This young woman may be perfectly pleasant, but she comes from a world entirely different from ours. The differences that seem charming now will become sources of conflict later. Her background doesn't matter to me. It should matter. It will matter to your children, who will struggle to find their place in society. It will matter to your business associates, who expect their partners to maintain certain standards. It will matter to everyone we know." William stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'm disappointed in you, Mother. I expected better from someone who married for love herself. Your father and I came from similar circumstances. We understood each other's expectations and obligations. This situation is entirely different. The only difference is your prejudice against the Irish." Eleanor's mask of composure finally slipped. "It's not prejudice, William. It's reality. These people are not like us. They have different loyalties, different values, different priorities. This girl will change you, and not for the better. This conversation is over," William said coldly. "I'm going to propose to Bridget tonight, with or without your blessing." After he left, Eleanor sat alone in the dining room for nearly an hour, staring at her untouched breakfast. The die was cast. William would not be dissuaded by arguments or threats. He was going to marry this Irish girl, and when he did, Eleanor's control over the family fortune and legacy would end forever, unless she took action to prevent it. The engagement of William Pemberton to Bridget O'Sullivan was announced in the Hartford Courant on September 15, 1840. The brief notice, placed in the society section, generated more discussion than any social news in recent memory. At tea parties and gentlemen's clubs throughout the city, people debated whether William had lost his senses or simply succumbed to Irish seduction. Eleanor maintained a facade of gracious acceptance while privately seething. She attended social functions where well-meaning friends offered congratulations mixed with barely concealed sympathy. "How progressive of William," they would say, their voices carrying undertones of scandal. "I'm sure the girl is quite suitable." The worst moment came at a Ladies' Aid Society meeting where Mrs. Harrison Fitzgerald, whose own Irish ancestry was conveniently forgotten by Hartford society, made a pointed comment about the importance of maintaining proper standards in marriage. "Of course, we must be charitable to these immigrant families," she said, glancing meaningfully at Eleanor. "But there are appropriate boundaries that shouldn't be crossed." Eleanor smiled tightly and changed the subject, but the humiliation burned in her chest like acid. She was being pitied, patronized by women who had once deferred to her social position. The Pemberton name, which had opened every door in Connecticut, was becoming a source of whispered gossip and snide commentary. During this period, Eleanor began to study Bridget O'Sullivan with the intensity of a military strategist examining an enemy position. She attended public events where the couple appeared, watching how Bridget moved, spoke, and interacted with Hartford's elite. What she observed only deepened her alarm. Bridget was not the simple Irish peasant Eleanor had hoped to find. The young woman possessed a natural elegance that could not be taught, an intelligence that shone in her conversations, and a genuine warmth that drew people to her. Even Eleanor's harshest critics among the society matrons admitted that the O'Sullivan girl had remarkable poise for someone of her background. More troubling was the obvious depth of William's devotion. He looked at Bridget with an adoration Eleanor had never seen from him before. When they walked together, he unconsciously matched his longer stride to hers. When she spoke, he listened with complete attention. When others made subtle social slights, he defended her with a fierce protectiveness that reminded Eleanor uncomfortably of how Jonathan had once defended her against similar treatment. The wedding was scheduled for October 13th. William had wanted a small ceremony, but Bridget insisted on inviting both families and their closest friends. "I want everyone we care about to witness our vows," she told him. "I don't want anyone to think we're ashamed of our marriage or trying to hide it." Eleanor realized that a public wedding would make her humiliation complete. Every prominent family in Hartford would attend, if only to satisfy their curiosity about the Irish bride. The ceremony would be discussed and dissected for months, cementing the Pemberton names association with social degradation. As September passed into October, Eleanor's desperation grew. She considered various strategies for disrupting the wedding plans. She could claim sudden illness, requiring William to postpone the ceremony to care for her. She could attempt to bribe Patrick O'Sullivan to withdraw his consent. She could even threaten to disinherit William entirely. But each option carried unacceptable risks. William might proceed with the wedding regardless of her illness or threats. Bribing the father could backfire spectacularly if he revealed her attempt to the wider community. And disinheriting William would mean losing control over him permanently, while ensuring that her fortune eventually passed to strangers. The solution came to Eleanor during a sleepless night in early October. She was reviewing her late husband's papers, searching for some legal mechanism that might give her continued control over the family assets, when she discovered Jonathan's correspondence with a business associate in New York who dealt in rare chemicals for industrial purposes. Among the letters was a detailed discussion of various compounds used in manufacturing processes, including their effects on human health when handled improperly. One letter specifically mentioned arsenic oxide, commonly used in textile production and available through legitimate commercial channels. Jonathan had been investigating its use in a proposed fabric treatment process, but had ultimately decided against the investment due to safety concerns. The letter included precise information about the compound's properties. Its appearance, white crystalline powder that dissolved easily in liquids. Its taste, virtually undetectable when mixed with strong flavors, and its effects, rapid onset of symptoms that mimicked various common ailments. Most importantly, the correspondent noted that arsenic oxide was difficult to detect without sophisticated chemical analysis, procedures that were rarely performed in cases of sudden illness. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, her heart racing as the implications became clear. Here was a means of preventing William's marriage that would appear entirely natural, tragic, but unavoidable. A sudden illness striking the bride during the wedding ceremony would be shocking but not unprecedented. Young women sometimes succumbed to the excitement and stress of their wedding day, especially those from lower social classes who might be overwhelmed by the grandeur of the occasion. The plan crystallized with shocking clarity. Eleanor would need to obtain arsenic oxide through her late husband's business contacts, claiming she was continuing his investigation into industrial applications. She would need to find an opportunity to administer it during the wedding ceremony, when all attention was focused on the bride and groom, and she would need to ensure that her own behavior appeared completely natural, that of a concerned mother-in-law witnessing a tragedy. On October 8th, 5 days before the wedding, Eleanor visited the offices of Hartwell Chemical Supply in New York City. She took the train early in the morning, dressed in her most respectable traveling clothes and carrying Jonathan's business correspondence as credentials. Mr. Hartwell, a thin man with nervous hands and wire-rimmed spectacles, remembered Jonathan favorably. "A cautious businessman," he told Eleanor. always concerned about safety and proper procedures. "How may I assist you, Mrs. Pemberton?" Eleanor explained that she was settling her late husband's affairs and wanted to complete his investigation into textile treatment processes. She produced Jonathan's letters and spoke knowledgeably about the proposed applications, having spent days studying the technical details. "Arsenic oxide, yes," Hartwell said, consulting his records. "Your husband was interested in its use for fabric preservation. Are you planning to proceed with the investment?" "I'm still evaluating the commercial potential," Eleanor replied smoothly. "But I'd like to conduct some preliminary tests to better understand the compound's properties." "Could you provide a small sample for experimental purposes?" Hartwell nodded and disappeared into his storeroom, returning with a glass vial containing perhaps 2 ounces of white powder. "This should be sufficient for your testing purposes. Please observe all safety precautions. The compound is highly toxic if ingested or inhaled." Eleanor paid in cash and carefully placed the vial in her reticule. During the train ride back to Hartford, she held her purse close to her body, acutely aware of its deadly contents. She felt no guilt, only a grim satisfaction that she had taken decisive action to protect her family's future. The remaining days passed in a blur of wedding preparations. Bridget had engaged Eleanor's help in planning the reception, a gesture of goodwill that Eleanor found simultaneously touching and infuriating. The young woman clearly hoped to win her future mother-in-law's approval through inclusive gestures and respectful attention. "I want you to feel that this is your celebration too, Mrs. Pemberton," Bridget said as they reviewed the menu for the wedding breakfast. "William speaks of you with such love and respect. I hope that someday you might feel the same affection for me." Eleanor managed to smile and nod appropriately, all while calculating exactly how much arsenic oxide would be required to ensure a swift but apparently natural death. Too little might cause illness without achieving her goal. Too much might create obvious symptoms that would raise suspicions. Based on Jonathan's correspondence and her own research in medical texts borrowed from Hartford's library, Eleanor determined that approximately 1/2 teaspoon of the powder, dissolved in wine, would be sufficient. The symptoms would begin within minutes and progress rapidly, mimicking the effects of extreme excitement or heart failure. On the morning of October 13th, Eleanor awoke before dawn with a clarity of purpose she had not felt in months. Every detail of the plan had been rehearsed in her mind dozens of times. She knew exactly when and how she would act, and the knowledge filled her with grim determination. The wedding ceremony was scheduled for 11 o'clock at Trinity Episcopal Church, followed by a reception at the Pemberton Mansion. Eleanor had volunteered to oversee the refreshment preparations, a responsibility that would give her complete access to the ceremonial wine that would be served to the bride and groom during the blessing. She dressed carefully in her finest dark blue silk gown, adding the pearl necklace Jonathan had given her on their own wedding day. Her reflection in the bedroom mirror showed a woman of dignified composure, every inch the respected Hartford matron attending her son's wedding. No one looking at her would suspect the deadly purpose that drove every measured movement. The arsenic oxide was hidden in a small silk sachet sewn into the inner pocket of her dress. The powder had been carefully measured and prepared the night before, ready to be dissolved in wine at the crucial moment. Eleanor had practiced the motion dozens of times, ensuring she could empty the sachet's contents quickly and naturally while appearing to adjust the wine service. At 9 o'clock, Eleanor arrived at Trinity Church to supervise the final preparations. The Gothic Revival building, with its soaring spire and stained glass windows, had been decorated with autumn flowers and ribbons in shades of gold and burgundy. Bridget's limited budget had not allowed for elaborate decorations, but the simple arrangements possessed an understated elegance that even Eleanor grudgingly admired. Father Matthews, the elderly Episcopal priest who would officiate, greeted Eleanor with respectful warmth. "Mrs. Pemberton, how lovely to see you. I understand you've been instrumental in organizing today's celebration." "It's my pleasure, Father," Eleanor replied smoothly. "This is such a joyous occasion for our family." She moved efficiently through the church, checking flower arrangements and supervising the placement of chairs for the reception. Her true focus, however, was on the communion table where the ceremonial wine would be placed. The heavy silver chalice, a wedding gift from Eleanor to the couple, sat ready for the blessing that would follow the exchange of vows. The wine itself was stored in the church vestry, along with the other refreshments that would be served after the ceremony. Eleanor had specifically requested that a bottle of their finest French vintage be opened for the occasion, explaining to Father Matthews that she wanted William and Bridget to begin their marriage with the best of everything. At 10:30, the first guests began arriving. Eleanor positioned herself near the church entrance, greeting each arrival with perfect social grace. She watched Patrick O'Sullivan escort his 3 younger children to their seats, noting how the man had clearly spent considerable money on new clothes for the occasion. His obvious pride in his daughter's marriage to a Pemberton stirred Eleanor's anger afresh. Members of Hartford's elite arrived in elegant carriages, their expressions carefully neutral as they took in the mix of social classes represented among the guests. Eleanor observed their subtle reactions, the way they nodded politely to the Irish families while maintaining careful distance. The social dynamics she had predicted were already playing out exactly as expected. William arrived at 10:45, accompanied by his friend Charles Whitman, who was serving as best man. Eleanor felt a pang of genuine love as she watched her son adjust his cravat nervously and speak in low tones with Father Matthews about the ceremony's progression. He looked handsome and happy, blissfully unaware that his mother was about to save him from the greatest mistake of his life. At precisely 11 o'clock, the church bells began to toll, and Bridget appeared at the rear of the nave. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat despite herself. The young woman was genuinely beautiful, her auburn hair arranged in an elegant style that complemented the simple but perfectly fitted white gown she had sewn herself. She carried a bouquet of white roses and baby's breath, and her face glowed with happiness that seemed to illuminate the entire church. Patrick O'Sullivan walked proudly beside his daughter, his hand resting gently on her arm. As they processed down the aisle, Eleanor noticed how many of the guests smiled involuntarily at the sight of the radiant bride. Even some of Hartford's most socially rigid matrons appeared touched by Bridget's obvious joy and dignity. The ceremony proceeded with traditional Episcopal solemnity. Father Matthews spoke about the sacred nature of marriage, the importance of mutual respect and devotion, and the blessings that awaited couples who built their union on firm spiritual foundations. William and Bridget exchanged vows in clear, confident voices, their eyes never leaving each other's faces. Eleanor watched from the front pew, her hand resting over the hidden sachet of poison. Soon, she told herself. Very soon, this travesty would be over, and William would be free to make a proper marriage with someone of his own class and background. Following the exchange of rings, Father Matthews moved to the communion table to begin the blessing of the wine. This was Eleanor's moment. She rose from her seat with practiced grace and approached the altar, ostensibly to assist with the ceremonial service as mother of the groom. "Allow me to help prepare the wine, Father," she said quietly, moving to stand beside the silver chalice. The priest nodded appreciatively and turned to address the congregation about the significance of sharing wine as a symbol of the couple's new union. While he spoke, Eleanor's fingers found the sachet in her dress pocket. With movements perfected through countless rehearsals, she emptied the white powder into the chalice and used a silver spoon to stir it gently into the deep red wine. The arsenic oxide dissolved completely, leaving no trace of its presence. The wine maintained its rich color and would taste no different than before, at least not to someone drinking it in the emotional excitement of their wedding day. Father Matthews completed his remarks and lifted the chalice ceremonially. "William and Bridget, please step forward to share the wine of commitment, symbolizing your promise to support each other through all of life's joys and sorrows." Eleanor returned to her seat, her heart pounding so hard she feared others might hear it. William and Bridget approached the communion table, their hands joined and their faces radiant with happiness. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. Father Matthews offered the chalice first to William, who took a small sip and passed it to his bride. Bridget accepted the chalice with both hands, smiled lovingly at her new husband, and raised the wine to her lips. Eleanor watched with terrible fascination as Bridget drank deeply from the poisoned chalice. The young woman's face showed nothing but joy and gratitude as she completed the ceremonial sip and returned the cup to Father Matthews. The deadly dose had been consumed. Now it was simply a matter of waiting for the arsenic to take effect. The wedding party processed from the altar amid the warm applause of the assembled guests. Eleanor joined the receiving line at the church entrance, accepting congratulations and compliments about the beautiful ceremony with mechanical pleasantness. Her entire attention was focused on Bridget, watching for the first signs that the poison was beginning to work. According to Eleanor's research, arsenic oxide typically began affecting its victims within 15 to 30 minutes of consumption. The initial symptoms would be subtle, perhaps a slight pallor, some difficulty breathing, or minor stomach discomfort. These early signs would be easily attributed to wedding day excitement and nerves. As the minutes passed, Eleanor began to feel a growing anxiety. Bridget appeared completely normal, chatting vivaciously with well-wishers and laughing at her new husband's jokes. Her cheeks remained pink with happiness, her breathing was regular, and she showed no signs of distress whatsoever. 25 minutes after consuming the poisoned wine, Bridget was still greeting guests with undiminished energy. Eleanor felt the first stirrings of genuine panic. Had she miscalculated the dosage? Was the compound she had obtained somehow defective? Or was this Irish girl possessed of an unusually strong constitution that could resist the poison's effects? The wedding party began moving toward the Pemberton mansion for the reception breakfast. Eleanor walked alongside Father Matthews, making polite conversation while internally screaming with frustration. Her carefully planned murder was failing, and she had no backup strategy for dealing with this catastrophic development. At the mansion, the guests gathered in the main drawing room and adjoining dining room, which had been decorated with more autumn flowers and set with Eleanor's finest china and crystal. A lavish breakfast spread awaited the party: fresh oysters from Long Island Sound, roasted fowl, delicate pastries, and several bottles of champagne for toasting the new couple. Eleanor moved through her duties as hostess with increasing desperation. 45 minutes had passed since Bridget consumed the arsenic, yet the young woman continued to appear perfectly healthy. She had removed her gloves and was accepting congratulations from Hartford's social elite with remarkable poise, showing no trace of the symptoms Eleanor had expected to see by now. "Mrs. Pemberton," said Mrs. Harrison Fitzgerald, approaching with a glass of champagne in hand, "you must be so proud. The ceremony was lovely, and your new daughter-in-law is absolutely charming, much more refined than one would expect from her background." Eleanor forced a smile. "Yes, Bridget is a lovely girl. We're very pleased with William's choice." The words tasted like ashes in her mouth. If the poison didn't work, she would be forced to accept this Irish peasant as her daughter-in-law permanently. The O'Sullivan family would become part of the Pemberton legacy, their Catholic traditions and immigrant connections forever linked to Eleanor's carefully cultivated reputation. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Hartford intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. As the breakfast progressed, Eleanor found herself studying Bridget with obsessive intensity. The young woman moved from group to group with William, accepting good wishes and engaging in animated conversations about their wedding trip to New York City. Her appetite appeared normal. She ate delicate portions of the food with obvious enjoyment and drank 2 glasses of champagne without any apparent ill effects. 1 hour after the poisoning, Bridget showed no symptoms whatsoever. Eleanor excused herself from the reception and retreated to her private study, closing the door behind her with barely controlled violence. She had risked everything on this plan, and it was failing spectacularly. The arsenic oxide had either been ineffective or insufficient to accomplish its purpose. But as Eleanor paced the length of her study, trying to formulate an alternative strategy, she heard commotion from the drawing room. Voices were raised in concern, and someone was calling for Dr. Harrison to be summoned immediately. Eleanor's heart leaped with renewed hope. Perhaps the poison was simply slower to take effect than her research had indicated. She composed her features into an expression of maternal concern and hurried back to the reception. What she found exceeded her most optimistic expectations. Bridget was seated in Eleanor's best wingback chair, her face pale and drawn. She was breathing rapidly and had one hand pressed to her stomach, while William knelt beside her chair looking frantic with worry. "I don't understand what's happening," Bridget was saying in a weak voice. "I felt perfectly fine just a moment ago, and then suddenly—" "What are her symptoms?" asked Dr. Harrison, who had been among the wedding guests and had responded immediately to the summons. "Stomach pain, nausea, and difficulty breathing," William replied, his voice tight with anxiety. "She says she feels like her throat is burning." Dr. Harrison, a distinguished man in his 60s who had served Hartford's elite families for decades, immediately began examining Bridget. He checked her pulse, looked into her eyes, and asked detailed questions about when the symptoms had begun and how they were progressing. Eleanor moved closer, feigning maternal concern while internally celebrating the poison's delayed but apparently effective action. "Dr. Harrison, is there anything we can do? Should we move her upstairs where she might be more comfortable?" "No, don't move her yet," the doctor replied grimly. "Mrs. Pemberton, I need you to send someone immediately to my office for my medical bag, and have your cook prepare a strong mixture of salt water, as much as the patient can drink." As Eleanor dispatched servants on these errands, she noticed that Bridget's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The young woman's breathing had become labored, and beads of perspiration dotted her forehead, despite the cool October air. Her hands trembled as she gripped the arms of the chair, and when she tried to speak, her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "The wine," Bridget managed to say, looking directly at Eleanor with eyes that seemed unnaturally bright. "The wine at the church. It tasted strange." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. Had Bridget somehow detected the poison's presence? Or was this simply the confused rambling of someone whose mind was being affected by arsenic toxicity? "What do you mean, dear?" Eleanor asked, keeping her voice steady. "The wine was from our finest vintage. Perhaps you're simply overwhelmed by all the excitement of the day." But Dr. Harrison had gone very still at Bridget's words. He looked up sharply, his experienced eyes moving from the bride to Eleanor and back again. "Mrs. Pemberton," he said carefully, "exactly what wine was served during the ceremony?" "French vintage from our private cellar," Eleanor replied. "The same wine we've served at family celebrations for years. Surely you don't think—" "I think," Dr. Harrison interrupted, "that we may be dealing with something more serious than wedding day nerves." He turned to William, who was holding Bridget's hand and murmuring reassurances. "Mr. Pemberton, I need you to send someone to Trinity Church immediately. Have them bring back the chalice that was used for the wine blessing and any remaining wine from the bottle that was opened for the ceremony." Eleanor felt panic rising in her chest. If Dr. Harrison examined the chalice and discovered traces of arsenic, her carefully constructed plan would unravel completely. She needed to prevent that examination at all costs. "Doctor, surely you're being overly cautious," she said. "The poor child is simply overwhelmed. Perhaps if we moved her to a quiet room." "Mrs. Pemberton," Dr. Harrison said with quiet authority, "I've been practicing medicine for 37 years. I've seen wedding day nerves, and I've seen food poisoning, and I've seen the effects of various toxic substances. This young woman's symptoms are consistent with arsenical poisoning." The words fell into the drawing room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and disbelief among the assembled guests. Several women gasped audibly, while the men moved closer to hear Dr. Harrison's diagnosis more clearly. William's face went white. "Poison? That's impossible. How could Bridget have been poisoned? She's eaten and drunk nothing that wasn't served to everyone else. Not everyone else drank from the ceremonial chalice," Dr. Harrison pointed out grimly. Only the bride and groom shared that wine. And you, Mr. Pemberton, show no symptoms of distress. Eleanor realized with growing horror that the doctor was systematically eliminating other possible sources of poisoning, focusing inevitably on the one moment when Bridget had consumed something different from the other guests. Her mind raced frantically, searching for some way to deflect suspicion. Perhaps the arsenic came from somewhere else entirely, she suggested desperately. These old buildings sometimes have lead pipes or other sources of contamination. But even as she spoke, Eleanor could see that Dr. Harrison wasn't convinced. His sharp eyes were studying her with an intensity that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. Behind his professional demeanor, she could sense a growing suspicion that chilled her to the bone. Meanwhile, Bridget's condition continued to worsen. Her breathing had become increasingly labored, and she was now struggling to remain conscious. The bright flush in her cheeks had given way to an alarming pallor, and when she tried to speak, only incoherent whispers emerged. "We need to get her to my office immediately," Dr. Harrison declared. "Mr. Pemberton, can your carriage accommodate a stretcher? Time is critical if we're going to save her life." The word save hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She had assumed that once the arsenic took effect, Bridget's death would be swift and irreversible. The possibility that medical intervention might prevent the poison from completing its work had never occurred to her. As William organized transportation to Dr. Harrison's office, Eleanor found herself trapped between desperate hope that Bridget would die before reaching medical help and growing terror that the young woman might survive to identify her poisoner. If Bridget lived, and if Dr. Harrison's suspicions continued to develop, Eleanor could face charges of attempted murder. The thought of standing trial before Hartford's legal establishment, of having her reputation destroyed and her freedom taken away, filled Eleanor with a panic more intense than anything she had ever experienced. Everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed to achieve, would be lost forever. The journey to Dr. Harrison's office took place in grim silence, with Bridget's condition deteriorating further during the short carriage ride. By the time they arrived at the doctor's practice on Main Street, she was barely conscious, and her breathing had become so shallow that William feared she might die before receiving treatment. Dr. Harrison's office occupied the ground floor of a substantial brick building, with examination rooms, a small surgery, and a dispensary where he prepared medications for his patients. Eleanor had visited the office several times over the years for routine ailments, but she had never seen it transformed into the scene of desperate medical intervention that greeted them now. The doctor immediately began administering treatments designed to counteract arsenic poisoning. He forced salt water down Bridget's throat to induce vomiting, hoping to eliminate any poison that remained in her stomach. When that proved insufficient, he prepared a mixture of milk and egg whites, explaining to William that these substances might help absorb toxins in the digestive system. Eleanor watched these proceedings with mounting anxiety. Each treatment that Dr. Harrison administered increased the possibility that Bridget might survive, and survival would mean exposure for Eleanor. She found herself in the horrifying position of hoping for a young woman's death while maintaining the appearance of a concerned mother-in-law. "Mr. Pemberton," Dr. Harrison said during a brief pause in his treatments, "I sent my assistant to Trinity Church to retrieve the ceremonial chalice. He should return shortly with evidence that will help us understand exactly how your wife was poisoned." Eleanor's hands clenched involuntarily at her sides. The chalice would contain residual traces of arsenic that would confirm Dr. Harrison's diagnosis beyond any doubt. Once he had physical proof of poisoning, his investigation would naturally focus on who had access to the wine and opportunity to administer the toxin. The assistant arrived 20 minutes later, carrying the silver chalice wrapped in a clean cloth, along with the bottle that had contained the ceremonial wine. Dr. Harrison examined both items carefully, using chemical tests that Eleanor had not known existed. "As I suspected," he announced grimly. "There are clear traces of arsenic compounds in this chalice, and the remaining wine shows similar contamination. This was not accidental poisoning. Someone deliberately added a substantial quantity of arsenic to the wine that was served to the bride." William stared at the doctor in shock. You're saying someone tried to murder my wife, but who would do such a thing? Bridget has no enemies in Hartford. Dr. Harrison's eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in the faces of everyone present. When his gaze settled on Eleanor, she felt as though he could see directly into her guilty soul. The question, Dr. Harrison said carefully, is who had access to the ceremonial wine between the time it was prepared and the time it was consumed. Eleanor forced herself to speak calmly. Surely any number of people could have tampered with the wine. Church staff, members of the wedding party, even random individuals who might have entered the building. Perhaps, Dr. Harrison replied. But arsenic oxide is not a common substance. Obtaining it would require specialized knowledge and connections to chemical suppliers. This was not a crime of opportunity. It required careful planning and deliberate preparation. The net was closing around Eleanor with terrifying speed. Dr. Harrison's methodical approach to the investigation was systematically eliminating alternative explanations and focusing attention on those who possessed both motive and means for the crime. At that moment, Bridget stirred on the examination table where she had been lying unconscious for nearly an hour. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked around the room with obvious confusion and distress. "William," she whispered weakly. "What happened? Where am I?" "You're in Dr. Harrison's office," William replied, taking her hand gently. "You've been very ill, but you're going to be all right now." Bridget's gaze moved around the room until it settled on Eleanor. For a long moment, the two women looked directly at each other, and Eleanor saw something in the young woman's eyes that made her blood run cold. "I remember now," Bridget said softly. "The wine. There was something wrong with the wine." Dr. Harrison leaned forward intently. "What do you remember about the wine, Mrs. Pemberton?" "It had a strange taste, not bitter exactly, but different. And I remember seeing—" Bridget paused, her brow furrowing with the effort of recollection. "I remember seeing someone near the chalice during Father Matthews's blessing. Someone who shouldn't have been there." Eleanor felt the walls of the room closing in around her. Bridget's memory was returning, and with it would come the identification that would destroy Eleanor's life forever. "Who did you see, dear?" Dr. Harrison asked gently. Bridget's eyes moved to Eleanor again, and this time there was no confusion in her gaze. "Mrs. Pemberton, I saw her stirring something into the wine while Father Matthews was speaking to the congregation." The accusation fell into the room like an explosion. William stared at his mother in shock and disbelief, while Dr. Harrison nodded grimly as if his suspicions had been confirmed. "Mother," William said in a voice barely above a whisper, "tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't try to murder my wife." Eleanor felt the last vestiges of her carefully constructed facade crumbling away. The game was over, the truth was out, and there was no longer any point in pretending innocence. She would have destroyed everything, Eleanor said quietly, her voice carrying a strange sense of relief at finally speaking the truth. "Your social position, the family reputation, our financial security, everything we've worked for would have been lost to an Irish immigrant who seduced you with her foreign charm." William stepped back from his mother as if she had struck him. "You tried to kill the woman I love because of her ancestry. I tried to save you from making the greatest mistake of your life," Eleanor replied with growing defiance. "That girl will drag the Pemberton name through the mud of Irish politics and Catholic superstition. Your children would have been outcasts, neither accepted by proper society nor welcomed by the immigrant community that would see them as traitors. Those children would have been your grandchildren," William said, his voice breaking with emotion. "They would have been half-Irish mongrels with divided loyalties and no place in respectable society." Eleanor snapped. "I would rather see the Pemberton line end entirely than watch it be polluted by foreign blood and alien traditions." Dr. Harrison had been listening to this exchange with professional detachment, but now he stepped forward with quiet authority. "Mrs. Pemberton, I'm afraid I have no choice but to notify the Hartford Constabulary about what has transpired here. You have confessed to attempted murder in the presence of multiple witnesses." Eleanor laughed bitterly. Do you think the authorities will prosecute a respected Hartford matron for trying to protect her family from immigrant corruption? Half the men on the city council share my concerns about the Irish problem. Perhaps, Dr. Harrison replied. But they also understand that poisoning is a serious crime, regardless of the perpetrator's social position. The law applies to everyone, Mrs. Pemberton, even wealthy widows who believe their prejudices justify attempted murder. The trial of Eleanor Pemberton began on November 20th, 1841, in Hartford Superior Court. The case attracted unprecedented attention throughout Connecticut and beyond, with newspapers from Boston to New York following every detail of the proceedings. The spectacle of a prominent society matron accused of poisoning her son's Irish bride captured the public imagination in ways that reflected the deep social tensions of the era. Judge Samuel Huntington, himself a member of Hartford's established elite, presided over the trial with scrupulous attention to legal procedure. Despite his personal acquaintance with Eleanor and sympathy for her social concerns, he could not ignore the overwhelming evidence against her. Dr. Harrison's testimony regarding the arsenic poisoning was supported by chemical analysis, Bridget's eyewitness identification, and Eleanor's own confession in the doctor's office. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Charles Morgan, presented the case as a calculated attempt at murder motivated by social prejudice and financial greed. The defendant, Morgan told the jury, placed her own narrow concerns about social status above the life of an innocent young woman whose only crime was falling in love with the defendant's son. Eleanor's defense attorney, Hartford's most prominent criminal lawyer, argued that she had acted under extreme emotional distress caused by her son's inappropriate marriage choice. He attempted to portray Eleanor as a devoted mother driven to temporary insanity by the prospect of her family's social destruction. The strategy failed completely. The careful planning required to obtain arsenic oxide, the deliberate timing of the poisoning during the wedding ceremony, and Eleanor's calculated behavior before and after the crime demonstrated premeditation that contradicted any claim of temporary insanity. Bridget's testimony proved particularly damaging to Eleanor's defense. The young woman had recovered completely from the arsenic poisoning, and she spoke with quiet dignity about the events of her wedding day. Her obvious intelligence and refinement made a powerful impression on the jury, undermining Eleanor's characterization of her as an unsuitable immigrant. I bear no personal hatred toward Mrs. Pemberton, Bridget told the court. I understand that she acted from love for her son, even though that love was expressed through terrible means. But I cannot forget that she tried to kill me, because she believed my Irish heritage made me unworthy of her family. William's testimony was the most emotionally devastating moment of the trial. He spoke of his love for both his mother and his wife, his shock at discovering Eleanor's crime, and his determination to ensure that justice was served regardless of family loyalty. My mother taught me to value honor, integrity, and moral courage, he told the court. Those same values now require me to testify truthfully about her actions, no matter how painful that truth might be. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on charges of attempted murder. Judge Huntington sentenced Eleanor to 15 years in the Connecticut State Prison, noting that her social position and previous good character had been considered in determining the length of her incarceration. The defendant's crime strikes at the heart of civilized society, Judge Huntington declared during sentencing. When prejudice and social ambition lead to attempted murder, the law must respond with appropriate severity to protect all citizens regardless of their background or origin. Eleanor received the sentence with the same composure she had maintained throughout the trial. She showed no emotion as the court officers led her away to begin her imprisonment, though observers noted that she avoided looking at William and Bridget as she left the courtroom. The Pemberton family's social position in Hartford never recovered from the scandal. William found himself ostracized by many of the families who had once welcomed him, though a few forward-thinking members of the community rallied to support him and Bridget. They moved to Boston shortly after the trial, where William established a successful law practice, and they raised 3 children who grew up to be prominent citizens of Massachusetts. Bridget proved to be everything William had believed her to be: intelligent, gracious, and devoted to their family's welfare. She became active in charitable organizations that assisted Irish immigrants, using her social position to bridge the gap between established American families and newcomers seeking better lives. Eleanor served 12 years of her sentence before being released for good behavior in 1853. She returned to Hartford as a broken woman, her fortune largely depleted by legal expenses and the costs of incarceration. She lived quietly in a modest boarding house until her death in 1858, never having reconciled with William or met her grandchildren. The silver chalice used in the poisoning was melted down by Trinity Church and the metal donated to a fund for Irish immigrants. Father Matthews, deeply shaken by the violation of sacred ceremony that had occurred under his supervision, instituted new procedures for wedding preparations that ensured multiple people were present whenever ceremonial items were being prepared. The case of Eleanor Pemberton became a cautionary tale told throughout New England about the dangers of unchecked prejudice and social ambition. Legal scholars pointed to it as an example of how even the most privileged members of society remained subject to the rule of law when they committed serious crimes. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the tragedy was its effect on Hartford's social attitudes toward Irish immigrants and other newcomers to American society. The obvious injustice of Eleanor's attempt to murder Bridget simply because of her heritage forced many established families to reconsider their own prejudices and assumptions. Dr. Harrison, whose quick thinking and medical expertise had saved Bridget's life, became a vocal advocate for treating all patients with equal care, regardless of their social background. His testimony during the trial had demonstrated the importance of applying scientific methods to criminal investigations, helping to establish forensic medicine as an essential tool for law enforcement. The poisoned chalice case, as newspapers dubbed it, remained a topic of discussion in Hartford for decades after the trial concluded. Parents used Eleanor's story to warn their children about the corrupting effects of hatred and prejudice, while legal professionals studied the case as an example of how social tensions could lead to violent crime. In 1865, 24 years after the poisoning, William Pemberton returned to Hartford for the first time since the trial. He was accompanied by Bridget and their 3 children, coming to visit his father's grave and to show his family the city where he had grown up. Old residents who remembered the scandal were struck by the obvious happiness and success of the couple, whose marriage had nearly ended in murder. Bridget, now a matron of 43 with gray threading through her auburn hair, stood beside her husband at Jonathan Pemberton's gravestone. She had never spoken publicly about forgiving Eleanor, but those who watched her pray silently at the cemetery understood that she had found peace with the traumatic events of her wedding day. The Hartford Courant, which had covered the original trial extensively, published a brief notice of the family's visit. The final paragraph of that article captured the ultimate irony of Eleanor's crime. The union that was nearly destroyed by poison has instead flourished into one of New England's most respected families, proving that love and character triumph over prejudice and hatred. This mystery shows us how fear and prejudice can drive even respectable people to commit unthinkable acts, and how the courage to stand up for justice can overcome even the deepest social divisions. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that social tensions could still drive someone to such desperate measures today? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about Eleanor's motivations and ultimate fate. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical mysteries like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark stories from America's past. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another forgotten chapter of our nation's hidden history.